Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. In the previous episodes, we have discussed the life of Stanisław Wojciechowski, Poland's second president, who was elected in 1922 and unseated by Marshal Pilsudski's May coup in 1926. In this episode, inspired by his life, we reflect on the differences between the politicians of old and the ones we have today. We discuss the historical differences that have shaped politicians in Western Europe and those which have shaped the political elite raised behind the Iron Curtain.
Was a rebellion, a nationalist rebellion, you could say, where these countries, they opposed the Soviet domination of their country, so they were fighting for national independence, national identity. So 1 year, a very big impact of these events, but directed in two completely different directions. So I think that explains a lot of the current differences, and also the hardship for the East to understand the West and for the West to understand the East. So sometimes when we see these clashes taking place on a European stage, in Brussels, in the European Parliament, for example, where some of these more progressive powers completely condemn what is happening in countries such as Poland or Hungary, I think simply there's a lack of understanding for the other side, and they aren't really aware of where the Eastern Europeans are coming from.
No, I think this is, you make a very good point, and it's a point which always struck me particularly, is that modern politicians seem surprisingly ignorant of history. Previous generations of politicians were very much motivated by, or guided, should I say, by history, what had happened, because that actually defined where we were today, and also gave us an indication of where we'd like to be tomorrow. And modern politics are completely oblivious, it seems to me. And but what's worse than being ignorant is this sort of willful ignorance. They seem happy that they are ignorant of the continent's history.
And I think we can go back to what you mentioned in a previous episode when you described how the foreign minister or secretary, Anthony Eden, the British secretary, had lost his brothers and his son to the First and Second World War. We could say that this historical ignorance that you mentioned from politicians also reflects that in previous years, many of these politicians, they had served in the army, and they were more realists than idealists.
Exactly.
They knew the flaws of human nature, and they knew that there isn't some kind of rosy, shiny utopia lying somewhere around the corner. And therefore I think that they were more grounded in reality. They knew history better, and they knew that it was important to learn from past mistakes, but also realize that there are some traits to human nature which simply are human and can't be completely rooted out of us.
Well, exactly. I think that's a good point. Yeah. That we live in an age now where very few politicians have any exposure at all to the concept of fighting. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher's government in 1979, a lot of her first cabinet had actually been in the armed forces.
Yes.
So even if they disagreed with her, A, by being in the armed forces, they'd been doing something for their country, but B, even if they disagreed with her, as many did, of course, they did have the concept of obeying an order from a superior.
Yes, and the question is, today, if the Falkland War would take place today, would the British political elite and technically the military as well, would they be ready to follow the same orders that Miss Thatcher?
Well, I think that the problem, and it's actually astounding. You know, the moment the Falkland conflict was over, the then Secretary of State for Defence, John Nott, immediately started cutting vast swathes of the armed forces. I mean, our armed forces now have. Don't get me started. But I mean, it is pitiful to see it. So the world is not any less dangerous than it was. Arguably, it's more dangerous because the whole concept of rules-based international organisation seems to be under threat.
Oh, yes.
And yet we have vast billions on billions and billions. You know, the British national debt has increased by 70%. The historic total national debt has increased by something like 75% over the last 15 years. And yet in that huge amount of spending, we still seem to be contemplating cutting the army further. It's bizarre.
And here we can get back to the point of realism, with realism versus utopianism and idealism in politicians. As you mentioned, this rules-based international order which is breaking down in front of our eyes. many of us, many of the political elite in the West, most or best exemplified by Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book The End of History, which was largely based on the belief that we had reached a stage where the international rules-based order had been embraced by the entire world, not by the West. But it turns out that it was only based on Western economic and military power. And now that that position is changing, this international-based, rules-based order is disappearing in front of our eyes.
And I think one of the reasons it's changing is because we have become, collectively at least, less willing actually to stand up for what we believe. The politics issue these cliches about X, Y, and Z, but they actually, on a day-to-day basis, they undermine those values which created. You know, you can't undermine the foundations of the house and then complain about a crack in the roof. I mean, these things are related.
Absolutely. And maybe one last idea here is that, as we mentioned, it's clear to all of us that the main threat right now is the growth of China, whether their navy or their economy or all of it taken together, but also the way how we respond to it. The problem which was even visible during the presidency of Barack Obama, but accelerated during Trump's presidency. Biden ran on a platform of fixing this problem, but it seems like the Europeans aren't willing, is simply that there is no more transatlantic unity that we had after 1945. Europe wants to go its own way. It doesn't want to form a cohesive strategy to counter China's rise. And therefore, with this new giant taking place on the international stage, if the larger Western civilization isn't united, then, well, as the old saying goes, united we stand, divided we fall. And unfortunately, it seems that we haven't learned that lesson either. Indeed.
Well, let's hope we don't fall, because that's been fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. We must look at this again in more detail next time. But there we are. Alas, that's been a fantastic, a very enjoyable talk with Adam, going through the life of Stanislaw Wojciechowski, and then taking those themes and developing them up to the modern era. That's the sort of thing we do on Poland Daily History. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History.